Welcome to this overview of what's new inside of Adobe Photoshop CS6. If you're watching this video in early 2012, you can download the free public beta from labs.adobe.com to test drive CS6 for yourself, and you're going to find out that this is a tremendous update. The amount of new features that Adobe put inside of CS6 is almost overwhelming. There's new layer enhancements giving you filtering and sorting options, making it easier than ever to find your layers. You can apply attributes to multiple layers. There's content-aware move, which is almost mind-boggling in the way that it works. You can move a selection and fill the empty space with relevant pixel information. There's shape layer enhancements, Camera Raw 7, the blur gallery, and new video in 3D features. But looking at Photoshop CS6, the most obvious change is the shading of the interface. Now you can control the shading by going to the Photoshop menu, and under the Photoshop menu you can choose Preferences, and from there you can choose Interface. Now if you're on the Windows side, the menu structure is the same, except it's under the Edit menu. Here inside the Preferences dialog box, you'll notice there's several color theme swatches, and you can select one of these swatches to change the interface. Of course, there is a keyboard shortcut available, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this. To change the interface shading with a keyboard shortcut, you're going to use Shift F2 to incrementally lighten the interface, or Shift F1 to incrementally darken the interface. If you're on a Mac laptop, you're going to have to hold down the Fn key in the bottom left-hand corner of the keyboard as well as the Shift key while pressing F1 and F2. So that's the big interface change. The layout has mostly stayed unchanged, but you will notice that the mini bridge is now docked down here towards the bottom. You can double-click it to open it and double-click it to close it. Finally, you can control the pasteboard color independently of the interface. All you have to do is contextually click on the pasteboard, and you'll notice you have several different color values from black to light gray. You can also select a custom color. If you choose that, a color picker will open, and you can choose whatever color that you want. If you go ahead and click OK, you'll notice it's been updated independently of the rest of the interface. I'm going to go ahead and switch that back to the default. There's a lot to get to. There's a lot of new features that I want to share with you inside of this title. So over the next few movies, we're going to do just that. We're going to explore the new features of Adobe Photoshop CS6. Even though Photoshop has a tremendous amount of capability when it comes to image editing, you will ultimately be using Photoshop at some point to crop your images. And if you've worked with previous versions of Photoshop, the crop tool left much to be desired. Well, not anymore. In Photoshop CS6, the crop tool has been greatly enhanced, and by default, it works in a non-destructive manner. This is critical to producing the best possible results with the crop tool in the shortest amount of time. If you remember in previous versions, if you cropped something and you weren't exactly happy with it, there was no way to get back to that previous crop bounding box that you had. You had to start all over again. Like I said, the new crop tool in Photoshop CS6 makes this so much easier. Before I use the crop tool, I just want you to take note that I'm working with a flattened image, so I have a background layer. I'm now going to come over and select the crop tool, and when I select it, you'll notice immediately it looks completely different, and it's because it is completely different. Now, before I perform the crop in any way, I'd like to point out that this bounding box, the way it's set up by default, is going to give you a tremendous amount of feedback. This feedback ultimately is going to allow you to create a precise crop. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. I'm just going to go ahead and drag this corner into the center of the image, and you'll notice the entire image moves. This, again, allows you to precisely set this bounding box exactly where you want it. What if it's not exactly where you want it right now? Well, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge it around, and you'll notice the entire image is moving relative to that bounding box. You could also click and drag inside of it to move it around. Also in Photoshop CS6, whenever you're working with the Move tool, you'll see this new heads-up display, providing you with critical information about where you're moving this image. Also notice inside the Layers panel, instead of it being a background layer, it's now a crop preview layer. And we have a floating layer, ultimately preserving the information that we're about to discard. So if I go ahead and press Enter or Return to accept the crop, you'll notice inside of Photoshop now it looks like it's cropped. And if we take a look inside the Layers panel, there's a little clue here telling us that we didn't lose that information, it's this floating layer. Meaning, if I decide that I want to adjust this crop, all I have to do is come in and modify it. The crop is set up exactly where I cropped it last, even if I went and did several other things after the fact. So if I decide that I want to take this out a little bit, if I click and drag, all those old pixels are there. So I have that ability. And if I want to drag this to the right, I can do that, maybe tighten this up a bit. I have all this control with the new crop tool. So once you commit to a crop, you're not forever stuck with the image in that way. So I'm going to go ahead and use the arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge it around. I'm going to go ahead and perform the crop again by pressing Return or Enter. Now, you don't have to preserve the discarded pixels. If you want to get rid of them completely, you can select Delete Cropped Pixels. And if you really prefer the old crop tool, not sure why you would, but maybe you do, under this little sprocket menu, you can use the classic mode. So just know that that option is available. Finally, what I'd like to do is show you one additional new feature with this crop tool. And in order for me to do it, I want to get back to the original document. So I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Revert to get back to that flattened image. Now, if you want to straighten the image, you could certainly come over and use the ruler tool like in previous versions of Photoshop. It works the same way. But you don't necessarily have to. If you come over and highlight the crop tool, with the crop tool selected, you'll notice there's a new Straighten button. If you select that, you can then click and drag along the horizon. And when you do, it's going to shift the image and create the perfect bounding box for the crop. You can press Enter or Return to perform the crop. And again, we preserved all the discarded pixels. They're still there. If we want to make a modification, we just need to reactivate the crop tool and click on the bounding box, and we can re-perform the crop after setting the image exactly where we want it. Remember, you don't have to always work with the crop tool. If I come back and do anything else, like make a selection, do some painting, if I always return back to this crop tool, I still have those pixels available to me. So it's not a one-shot deal. It's preserved within this floating layer. And that's the new crop tool inside of Photoshop CS6. Now, this next feature isn't going to be one that blows you away in terms of its new technical capability that's built into Photoshop, but rather this feature will save you an enormous amount of time when you're working inside of the program. In fact, I think this could be one of the most important upgrades in Photoshop CS6. What I'm talking about is the ability to filter your layers. Anytime you're working with an artistic composition, or in this case, a website layout, chances are your Layers panel is going to be cluttered with a variety of different layers. Now, there are things that you can do already inside of Photoshop CS5 to find elements within your Layers panel. For example, you can contextual click on an element, and that should select it in the contextual menu. But if you have overlapping pixel information across multiple layers, well, this feature doesn't really work. So what are you left with? Then you're left with turning the visibility of layers on and off and hoping to find the exact one that you're looking for. Well, this new filtering capability inside of CS6 makes this so much easier to find your content. What I'm talking about inside the Layers panel is this top bar. And you'll notice we have a drop-down menu here giving you the ability to filter based upon a variety of different categories. If you have kind selected, you'll notice that we have a series of icons. Each of these icons represents something different, but if you mouse over it, a little tooltip will appear telling you what you're going to filter for. So if I wanted to see only the type layers, I could select this button, and only the type layers will appear. You can also add to the filtering if you wanted to see not only the type layers, but also layers that have pixel information. You can click this button. So you can continue to add to that filter. Something else that I want to point out, if I turn all of these off, I'm going to collapse all these layer groups. Now, as I collapse them, you can see that all of our layers are categorized in some way. If you apply a filter, like if you look for an adjustment layer, for example, if you select this filter button, the layer groups are essentially disregarded. You're no longer seeing that grouped structure, so it makes it a lot easier for you to isolate and find the exact layer that you're looking for. So using these buttons gives you the ability to look for specific elements within your document. You also have the ability to turn off the filtering capability altogether by clicking this button. Essentially, this entire bar is grayed out now. You don't have the ability to filter, but we're going to keep it on. So not only can you filter by kind, but you'll notice you can also filter by name. Let's say, for example, you're looking for the layer that has these iPhones, and maybe you want to change them out to Android devices. Well, what you can do is hope that whoever created this composition named their layers appropriately, but if you type in the word iPhone now, you'll notice I'm seeing all the layers that contain iPhones. So if I wanted to, I could turn these off, and then I could add my Android devices, and that quickly I was able to find the elements that I needed. Not only can you filter by name, but you can also filter by effect. If you're looking for a specific effect inside your composition, you can select from this list in the drop-down menu. So here I can see I have a bevel and emboss effect on this arrow. You can also sort by mode. So if you have a blending mode like overlay, multiply, normal, you'll see all those layers that contain that blending mode. Attribute is incredibly powerful. How many times have you worked in a composition and you have layers that just got left over from things that you were doing but decided not to use, and they end up being empty layers, just taking up space in the Layers panel? Well, what you can do is find all the empty layers by selecting this option from the menu, and it will display all the empty layers in the composition. Fortunately, in this composition, I don't have an empty layer, but this attributes menu is fairly powerful. If you're looking for a layer mask, it's going to show you all the layers that have a layer mask. And finally, you can also sort by color. If you label your layers with a particular color, you'll be able to find those elements. If you just want to find the layers that were labeled with red, they'll appear in the Layers panel. So this new filtering capability in the Layers panel makes it so much easier when working with multi-layer compositions in terms of finding specific elements within the document. Having the ability to filter the layers are not the only improvements that Adobe's made to the Layers panel. There's a whole series of small incremental changes that quite honestly just make sense that designers have been asking for years that Adobe decided to finally add to CS6. The developers there took on this initiative called JDI, which stands for Just Do It, and they've taken all these little feature requests and finally built them into Photoshop CS6. These little changes hopefully will make you more productive inside the program. What you can do now inside the Layers panel is apply attributes to multiple layers. So for example, if you wanted to lock or unlock multiple layers, you now have that ability. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. What I'm going to do is come over to the texture overlays. In here, you can see I have a series of layers. I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to select stars, hold down the Shift key, and select scratch. With all of these layers selected, notice I can now lock all of those layers. Of course, I can also unlock the layers, but any one of these attributes I could apply to all of the layers. Again, something that just makes sense. It should have always been in there. You also have the ability to apply effects to layer groups. Before, if you wanted to apply effects to multiple layers, you would have to kind of create a smart object or combine the layers into one another. You would have to kind of finagle it to work in a way that you wanted it to work. Well, no more. What I want to do is add a drop shadow to this text down here. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and zoom into it so you can see it. I'm going to go ahead and expand the Titles and Details layer group. And in there, I have two nested layer groups called DJ Names and Date Place, which happens to be nested inside of Details. But the DJ Names, if I turn off the visibility temporarily, you can see it's this text right here. If I want to apply a drop shadow to those layers before, again, over 4 layers, you would have to create a smart object. Here, I can select the layer group, and with the layer group selected, I can choose FX, and then I can choose drop shadow. I'll go ahead and click OK. You can see the drop shadow is now applied to all the layers in this layer group. I'll go ahead and do that one more time. I'll collapse DJ Names, and I'll select Date Place. That layer group is selected. In the Effects menu, I'm going to go ahead and choose Drop Shadow, and now the drop shadow is applied to this text, which means it's spanning across multiple layers within this layer group. So that's a great improvement. You also have other ways to navigate the Layers panel in a more efficient manner. For example, if you wanted to expand a layer group, and the layer group has nested layer groups, you can spend a lot of time expanding and collapsing multiple layer groups. Well, if you wanted to quickly expand not only a layer group, but all the sub-layer groups inside of it, what you can do is hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on the layer group, and it expands not only that layer group, but any nested layer groups inside of it. Now, you could also collapse doing the same thing, holding down the Alt key on Windows, Option on the Mac. But what if you wanted to expand all the top-level layer groups? You can do that as well. All you have to do is hold down the Command key on the Mac. It would be the Control key on Windows. Go ahead and do that, and now all the top-level layer groups are expanded. The other thing that you can do is you can jump copies of multiple layers inside of Photoshop CS6. For example, if I select these two layers, I can use the keyboard shortcut Command-J or Control-J on Windows, and you'll notice that both of those layers are now duplicated and jumped onto new layers. So there you have it. There's some new enhancements within the Layers panel inside of Photoshop CS6 that hopefully is going to make you more productive inside of the program. The last thing that I'd like to mention when it comes to the Layers panel actually has to do with the panel above it right now, which is the Adjustments panel. In previous versions of Photoshop, all the properties associated with a particular adjustment were contained within the Adjustments panel. And this would create a little bit of havoc within the interface because chances are you're going to have a fairly tall Layers panel, and then the Adjustments panel would also need quite a bit of real estate. So you're always playing this game of collapsing the Layers panel, expanding the Adjustments panel, so on and so forth. So what Adobe's done now is they've broken out the properties for the adjustment and they've placed it inside the Properties panel. Let me show you what I mean. Here inside this layer, I have a couple of adjustments. If I go ahead and double click on the adjustment, notice it opens up the Properties panel, a separate panel, and these options are no longer attached to the Adjustments panel, but rather are a part of this panel. And what's nice about this panel is you can toggle back and forth between the adjustment and the layer mask if there happens to be one. Additionally, if you're working with an adjustment that doesn't have quite as many options, for example, I have one down here. If I go ahead and double click it, I have a gradient map. You can see I have a lot of empty space here. So I can collapse this panel a little bit, tightening it up, making more room for me to look at the actual image. So again, not a huge change, but one that I think you should be aware of in terms of how you're going to be working with these adjustments inside of Photoshop CS6. If you've used Photoshop CS5, you may have used Content-Aware Fill that would allow you to fill an empty space with relevant pixel information. Well, they've built that into a new tool called Content-Aware Move that gives you the ability to perform that operation in one shot. You can move an element and fill its empty space with relevant pixel data. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. I'm going to come over and highlight a selection tool. I'm going to choose the lasso tool, and I'm just going to make a fairly generous selection around this boat. I'm using a trackpad on a laptop, so you can imagine I don't have all that much precision available to me. But once I make the selection, if I were to come over and highlight the Move tool and then click and drag this to a new location, it leaves a hole in the image and it's filled with the background color. So that's not helpful. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. What I want to do instead is come over and access the hidden tool underneath the Spot Healing Brush tool called Content-Aware Move. Now, there's a couple options here. The first thing is the mode, which is set to move by default. We'll take a look at the other option in just a bit. And then there's also adaptation. The adaptation is how the moved object adapts to its new background. Very loose is used if you have a generous edge selection like I do here. You could use very strict if you have a stricter selection. The default is set to medium, but the great thing about this menu is you can always alter it after the fact, so you don't need to commit to it right away. If you perform the move and want to change it, you always have that option available to you. So with the content-aware move tool selected, what I'm going to do is click and drag this boat to a new location. I'm going to place the boat right here. I'm going to try to match up the horizon line, making it a little bit easier for Photoshop. Once I let go of the mouse, a calculation is performed, and you'll notice that the boat looks pretty darn good in its new location. And where it was also looks pretty good. You may have to make a small adjustment here, but overall, the empty space has relevant pixel data. It barely looks altered at this point. Now again, if you want to control the adaptation after the fact, like set this to loose to maybe get some better results in here, you can do that. Quite frankly, I think it looked a little bit better on the strict side. I'll go ahead and choose strict, and then the calculation will be recalculated, and I think that's probably the best bet. I can go ahead and deselect this, Command D or Control D on Windows, and now, with minimal effort, the image already looks pretty darn good by simply moving the boat from one location to another location. If you want to get it perfect, you can go in there and make some more modifications, but overall, it's a great starting point. So what's the deal with the other mode here? We also have an extend option. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this could work. I have a document here called waterextend.psd, and on the first layer, I have this background of actually the image we were just looking at. But let's say I wanted to create a bigger background. I don't have too many options here. I could try to scale it using content-aware scale, but this is a lot of ground to make up. I could duplicate this part of the image, but it's going to look like a repeating pattern, so that's really not going to work either. What I can do here is select all on this layer, and with everything selected, I can set the mode to extend. Again, I'm going to set the adaptation to medium. You can play with that after the fact if you're not happy with the results. But what I'm going to do now is simply click and drag this to the right, try to match up the two edges. Once I let go of the mouse, you'll notice Photoshop performs a calculation, and again, it looks pretty good and consistent across this horizon line. So this new content-aware move tool, again, is a great way to move elements within an image and have Photoshop do the heavy lifting in terms of calculating exactly what the pixels should look like. Adobe's also added their content-aware fill technology to the patch tool, and this can be extremely helpful but also extremely frustrating. You need to know when is an appropriate time to use it. I'm working with this document called cat.jpg. It's available in your resources folder if you want to follow along. What I want to do is get rid of the cat from the field altogether. Now, in previous versions of Photoshop, there's a variety of different ways that you could do this. One way would be to use the patch tool. Of course, you could also use content-aware fill, but let's go ahead and take a look at how the patch tool would do in terms of removing the cat. I'm going to come over and select the patch tool. With the patch tool selected, you'll notice that there's a menu here. There's a menu that gives you the choice of normal or the new content-aware option. Let's leave it set to normal. What I'm going to do is make a selection around this cat. And again, it's going to be a fairly generous selection. I'm not going to spend a lot of time making an accurate selection. So I've selected the cat. Now what I want to do is come over and highlight the patch tool. In this case, I'm going to leave the mode set to normal. I'm then just going to click and drag the cat to a different location, or I should say this selection. And when I let go of the mouse, Photoshop does a pretty good job of matching luminance values, but you'll notice that it takes this pattern. We essentially see this pattern in duplicate over here. But overall, the end result is pretty good. Looking at this at first glance, it doesn't look all that altered. Now, I'm going to come over to the history panel and go back a couple steps. Here, what I want to do is move the cat again, but this time I'm going to choose Content Aware. Remember, what Content Aware is going to try to do is consider the neighboring pixels when it fills this area. And in this case, where we have a variety of textures and patterns, it doesn't do as good of a job. Remember, the way that it does its blending is it blurs the edges. And in this case, if I move this selection over here, Photoshop just blurs the edges too much to be useful. And I don't know if you can see that in the video or not, but here inside of Photoshop, it's just too blurry. The previous patch tool option of normal did a much better job. Well, let's take a look at where this new content aware option for the patch tool is useful. I'm going to come over to oldcar.tiff, which is also available in the resources folder. And in this case, if I want to remove the road to make it look like this old car is sitting in the middle of a field somewhere, what I'm going to do is make a selection. Again, I'm going to go ahead and select this area of the road. And again, I'll probably have to do this a couple of times to get it to be perfect. As I get closer to the car, it gets a little bit more complicated to fill this edge in precisely. But here, what I'm going to do is come back to the patch tool. And in this case, I'm going to switch it back from content aware to normal. And if I click and drag this selection in the grassy area, the area that I want Photoshop to use to fill the road, you'll notice it doesn't do the best job. And that's because it's considering, again, the luminance values of the pixels within the road and considering them in this new information, which ultimately doesn't look good at all. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that, Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows. And this time, I'm going to come back to the patch menu, and I'm going to switch it to content aware. This is going to do a much better job in this situation. As I click and drag, you want to stay away from the edges of the canvas because you don't want to get these straight lines to the left and to the right of the patch above. So if I go ahead and place it in this area and let go of the mouse, you'll notice the area that does get filled in looks a lot better now that we're using the content aware mode for the patch tool opposed to the normal mode. So again, it's not a huge change, but it certainly can change the way that you work with the patch tool. You just need to know when to use content aware over the normal mode for the patch tool. We're going to shift away from image editing here for just a bit and talk a little bit about type. Now, in previous versions of Photoshop, if you had multiple type layers and you had to make a similar change to all of those type layers, you had no choice but to go into each layer with the type tool and make those modifications. Well, in Photoshop CS6, they've come up with character styles that would hopefully alleviate a lot of those repetitive tasks. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to come over and highlight the type tool. With it selected, I'm just going to type in the word sample a couple of different times. So here I have the word sample. I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key to duplicate it. I'll just create a few duplicates here. So we have 4 type layers, all of which use the same attributes in terms of their font, the size, everything else. Well, what we're going to do is come up to the Window menu. And under the Window menu, we're going to choose Character Styles. This opens up the Character Styles panel. Now, we haven't created a style right now. So right now, inside the Character Styles panel, it reads None with a plus sign. It simply means that you're using the default style, but you've added to it. And in this case, we don't want that set up as a style. So I'm going to click this button right here, which will clear any overrides of the default style. So go ahead and click it, and you'll notice the text returns. I'll come over here and select this layer and click this button. I'll just do that a couple of different times. So what this is doing is essentially removing any styles from the type. Now what I want to do is create a new character style. And if I have text selected, if I come over and choose the type tool and select this text here, with it selected, if I create a new character style, I'll get real-time feedback about what the style looks like if you're having any concerns about what it will look like on screen. So after creating this new character style, if you double-click it, it will open up the character style options. And here you can name the style. I'll just call it My Style. I'm not all that creative right now. You can choose a font from the font family drop-down menu, so I'll go ahead and select maybe this font here, and you can see it instantly update on screen. So if I want to change the font size, I have that ability. I can come in here and make any modifications to basic character elements. There's some more advanced character formats over here on the right, such as stretching it out vertically or horizontally. You can also use superscript options or subscript options. And there's also open type features. So if an open type font has things like ligatures, you can use that information as well. But for our purposes right now, this is fine. I'll go ahead and click OK. Once I click OK, I have this style set up in the characters panel. So let's just say now I wanted all of this text to look the same. So I'll go ahead and apply my style to each of these instances of the text sample. So again, I'm going to come over and highlight the type tool. I'm going to select this text, apply my style, and then the same thing over here. I'll just come over and highlight the type tool and apply my style. So from there, you can already see that it was somewhat easier. You didn't have to go in and change the font for each individual piece of text. You did have to select it and apply the character style, but now, what if you wanted to update this? So you have all this text that uses the same style, and let's just say you're reviewing it and you really decide that this text is a little bit too big and you want to reduce the size. Again, in previous versions of Photoshop, you would have to go in to each individual text layer and change the font size. Well, no more with the Character Styles panel. All you have to do is double-click your style, and here you can change the font size. And notice that all instances of the type that use this style are updated. So this is a new feature inside of Photoshop CS6 that will hopefully increase your productivity when you're working with text inside the program. In the last movie, we were looking at how to work with the Character Styles panel, which gave us control over how to manipulate individual characters or even words. But what happens if you have a block of text, a paragraph? Well, in Photoshop CS6, they've also created a Paragraph Styles panel, which quite frankly works in a very similar fashion to the Character Styles panel. Let me go ahead and quickly show you how it works. I'm going to come over and highlight the Type tool. With the Type tool selected, I'm just going to click and drag out an area that I want my paragraph of text to appear in. Now, in previous versions of Photoshop, I would have to go find my own text and paste into this text box, but not anymore. If you need placeholder text, you can go to the Type menu, and under the Type menu, you can choose Paste Lorem Ipsum, which is essentially this Greek text. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this paragraph, and then I'm going to paste it. So I have two paragraphs here. And then I'm going to open up the Paragraph Styles panel. I'm going to make sure this text is selected, and under the Window menu, I'm going to choose Paragraph Styles. And here you can see I have a basic paragraph style applied. I'm going to go ahead and click this button right here, which is going to strip it of any formatting, making sure that it is set to its default. Once I've done that, I'm going to create a new paragraph style. It's named Paragraph Style 1. If I double-click it, it's going to open up a similar dialog box as the character styles, except you'll notice you have some additional options. You can work with indents in spacing, composition, justification, and hyphenation. Now, if you're not familiar with the terms hyphenation, or you don't really fully understand justification or composition, we certainly do talk about this in our InDesign titles when typography seems to be a bigger issue. But nevertheless, what I'd like to do is just show you here in the basic character formats that you can in fact change something like the font size, and it will be updated. You can even change the leading, which is the line spacing. So if I want to increase that, I'd have that ability to space it out a little bit more. You also notice you have several other options available inside this dialog box. I'm just going to go ahead and call this My Style again, and then I'll go ahead and click OK. This is now applied to this block of text. Now the great thing about this is if I create other blocks of text, I'll be able to easily format it to match this by simply applying the My Style paragraph style that I created. And of course, if you ever need to make a change or an update, all you have to do is double click this. It's going to return you to the same dialog box. You can make that modification and click OK, and everything is updated and saved within that paragraph style. So when you're working with type inside of Photoshop, it just got a lot easier in terms of how you can format not only at the character level, but also the paragraph level using the new character styles and paragraph styles inside of Photoshop CS6. Vector shapes in Photoshop CS6 have also been greatly improved. If you want to work with vector objects now inside of Photoshop, it's a lot more like working with, let's say, Adobe Illustrator. It's more of a vector-based programmed approach to working with vector artwork. So let's quickly take a look at some of these vector enhancements inside of CS6. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a vector layer. I'm going to come over here and choose one of the drawing tools like the rectangle tool. And you'll notice up top in the options bar, you have all sorts of different options for working with this vector shape. Before we look at these options, though, what I'd like to do is just click and drag out a shape onto the canvas. Now that I have the shape, you'll notice right now I'm working with a black fill. I can open this up and at any point in time change the fill color Notice you can also change how you're coloring this shape. You could use a solid color, which we're using now. You could go with a gradient or even a pattern. And if you wanted to, you could go with no fill at all, so you're just working with the stroke. In our case, we do want to go with a solid color. I'll leave it set to this blue, that's just fine. You can also come over and modify the stroke, and again, like the fill, you can also fill the stroke with a gradient or pattern. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go with a color here. I'll select maybe a darker blue. And you can see that that stroke is now applied to the shape. Now right now we have align edges selected, and this is great for web designers because it's going to snap your object to the pixel grid. If you're going to be working with align edges, it would be my recommendation to work with pixel values here with the stroke opposed to points. Now again, what makes this so much better is you can always come in at any point in time and make modifications to this shape. If you want to change the appearance of the stroke, you can do that by using one of these presets. You can change how the stroke is aligned to the object, whether it be inside, in the middle of the object, or on the outside of the object. You can also change the caps and the style of the corners. If you want to customize one of these presets, you can click More Options, and it's going to open up a dialog box. And here you can change all three of those settings that we were looking at down here towards the bottom of the panel. But you can also control the dash size and the gap. So here, if I change the caps to round, and I reduce the dash length to 1, and I increase the gap, I have more of a dotted line effect. Now, anytime that you create a preset, if you have a feeling you're going to use it for other objects or use it later on down the road, you can go ahead and save it. And once you save it, you don't have to name it or anything. Once you click OK, you'll see that it appears inside the Stroke Options panel. There's also some additional options associated with the path. If you come over and choose the black arrow tool down here, which Photoshop calls the path selection tool, with this highlighted, if you click on the shape, anytime you make a change up here in the options bar, you're going to get real-time feedback here in the canvas. So if you want to increase the size or decrease the size of the stroke, you have that ability. And again, you're getting that information relayed back to you in real time. But also notice you have some of the standard options that you normally would have in a vector-based program. Here, notice you have all these Pathfinder options that you would normally find in a program like Illustrator. You also have alignment options, and you also have a stacking order menu. So there's all sorts of different options here that are available inside of CS6. Now that I have the shape selected within the document, what I want to do is maybe align it to the canvas. And you'll notice right now, down here towards the bottom, there's an Align to Canvas option. If you select that, the menu goes away, so you're going to have to come back and reactivate it. But now you can choose horizontal centers, which is going to place it in the center of the canvas horizontally. And of course, if you want to do that vertically, you also have that option as well. So working with vector shapes inside of Photoshop CS6 has really gotten a lot more powerful. And in some cases, you may be able to bypass using a program like Illustrator and be able to work directly inside of Photoshop. There's several new brush enhancements in Photoshop CS6. Now, if you're someone that does a lot of drawing inside of Photoshop, you're going to find these features to be very helpful. Now, if you're someone that doesn't use these features all that often, if you don't have a pressure-sensitive tablet, then most of these options really won't matter to you. But I thought it would be worthwhile to point out some of the new things that Adobe added in CS6. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to come over and highlight the brush tool. With the brush tool selected, you want to open up the brushes. Now, if you don't have the brushes panel available over here on the right, you can always go to the window menu, and under the window menu, you can choose brush. So the two new brushes that I want to talk about are the erodible tips and the airbrush. There's also a new series of presets that you can use and some other additional painting options. But what I want to show you right now is the erodible tip. Now, the erodible tip is far more interesting if you have a Wacom tablet, and not just any Wacom tablet. You need the expensive Wacom tablet, the tablet that can understand a whole variety of different pressure points and angles. Now, I have the Wacom Bamboo, which is not the expensive tablet. This is the most affordable tablet. Now, you do get some benefit from this tablet. There is pressure sensitivity, and these new brushes will interact with that sensitivity, but nothing like the more expensive tablets. So just keep that in mind. If you don't use a drawing tablet, then quite frankly, you don't need to really watch this movie. There are a couple little tips that I will show you towards the end of the movie that will help people that don't use Wacom tablets. If you use a mouse, for example, to do your drawing, there are a couple things in here that will help you opposed to other people that do use tablets. But enough tablet talk. Let me show you these tips. What I want to do is come into the panel over here and find the new erodible tips. If you mouse over any one of these icons, you will get a tooltip, and it's telling you what type of tip it is. And in this case, it's an erodible point. Now, erodible simply means that it's going to erode, much like real drawing pencils and other types of mediums that you can work with. But nevertheless, here I have this erodible tip. There's sizing options, a softness option. Now, the higher the softness percentage, the quicker the tip will erode. You can also adjust the spacing, and once you get to it, you can also sharpen the tip. Notice the shape here. There's a menu of different options. These same options are replicated here inside the brushes panel. So what I want to do now is simply make some brush strokes. Now, I'm going to use my Wacom tablet, the Bamboo, the cheap tablet. But watch this little preview up here towards the top. If I start drawing, I'm just going to go ahead and drag my pen across the tablet. Not much is happening. And I'm really not applying that much pressure to the tablet. But if I start really applying a lot of pressure and bearing down on the pen, notice the preview is starting to wear out. Additionally, because the tip is starting to wear out, ultimately what I'm going to get is a different brush stroke altogether because the brush tip has changed. So this is, again, a lot like a real-world drawing experience. And if you needed to, you could always come over and click Sharpen Tip. And when you do that, the preview instantly gets sharp again. And if I start dragging my pen across the tablet, I have a finer brush stroke. But as I continue to do that, the brush stroke will get thicker and thicker. Again, if you have the more expensive tablet, the one that recognizes more degrees of pressure sensitivity and also angles of the pen, you're going to get even better results because you can begin to shape the tip. So that's the erodible tips inside of CS6. There's also some new airbrush tips as well. If I come over here and select the airbrush, notice there's several different presets that are already created for you, but I just want to kind of go over what some of these options are. Size is fairly self-explanatory. The hardness is going to limit the range of the spray. So the higher the value, the less airbrush spray you'll get. The distortion with a lower value here, you're going to get a tighter brush stroke. So if I come over and start to paint, it's going to look almost kind of like a paint can. And again, this is going to work so much better if you do have one of those higher level tablets because you're going to be able to play on the angle of the tip against the tablet. And again, this Bamboo tablet doesn't really do that. But I'm still getting a different look than if I just use the mouse. If I just use the mouse, when I click and drag, I get this very fine point. So you're out of the game completely when working with some of these tips if you are using a mouse. You get some of the options if you're using a lower-end tablet, and you get all the options if you're using a higher-end tablet. What if you are using a mouse and you want to get some of those tablet-like features? Well, there's a new option in here called Brush Pose. And if you select this and come over here and highlight the category to make adjustments here, you can manipulate the tilt. And you'll notice this brushstroke preview is changing. And also look at the brush tip now. It looks a lot more like the tip if you did have one of those more expensive tablets, which means now if I come over here and click and drag, I'm getting more of what you would expect from a tablet. You're getting this overspray effect that really isn't available without pressure sensitivity. So Adobe thought of that and built in some alternate options for you inside of CS6. There's also some new options with color dynamics. If you select this option, if you're working with color dynamics, you can apply per tip. So if I come over here and select a new foreground color like this red, and I select apply per tip, and what I'm going to do is turn off brush pose, and I'll just come back to brush tip shape. That should be fine. I'm just going to go ahead and start painting. And when I do, if I click and drag, you'll notice the brush stroke has all sorts of different colors in it. Now, there's another way to work here inside of CS6, and that is to turn off this checkbox in color dynamics with per tip. If you turn that off, what that means is every single time you make a brush stroke, that's where you'll get the different colors. So here I have this blue, and now I have a green. If I'll come over here and I get a different green, a different blue. So I'm getting a different color with each brush stroke, opposed to each brush tip, which is kind of continually changing the color values. So again, these are some new features inside of Photoshop CS6. I don't think you're going to use them if you don't do a lot of painting and drawing inside of Photoshop, but if you do, and you do have a higher end pressure sensitive tablet, these new features are going to make a huge difference in how you create artwork inside of Photoshop CS6. A limitation in previous versions of Photoshop was when you were working with an image like this image is fairly washed out. If you wanted to bring back some of the shadow detail, a quick and easy way to do that would be to go to the image menu, and under the image menu you could choose auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color. And you would have to kind of determine which one of these commands would be best suited for your image. And you would normally do that by testing it, looking at it, either deciding that you like it or you don't. If you don't like it, you would just undo it and try something else. Now, the problem with these commands is generally they wouldn't get you to where you needed to be with the image, but it gets you pretty close. So what would be nice is if you could use these commands as a starting point. And so that's kind of what Adobe did. What I'm going to do here is come down and apply an adjustment layer. I'm going to come down here and select a new brightness contrast adjustment. When I do that, it opens up the brightness contrast adjustment inside the properties panel, and you'll notice there's this new auto button. If you go ahead and click auto, you'll notice that Photoshop looks at the image and kind of determines what needs to be done and does it. And it shows you what that result is. And as you can see, if I turn the visibility of this adjustment on and off, it does improve the image, but you now have the ability to maybe decide that you want to increase the contrast a little bit more and maybe take down the brightness a little bit more. And by making those subtle adjustments, you're improving upon what Adobe's already provided for you. So this is a welcomed feature inside of CS6. Now, of course, brightness contrast is a very basic command in terms of how it can edit your image. If you want total control over all the luminance levels within the image, you're going to be using a more sophisticated adjustment like levels or curves. So let's go ahead and focus on levels. They both work in a similar fashion. So what I'm about to tell you here with levels is also true when applied to the curves adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of this brightness contrast adjustment, or you can trash it. It's completely up to you. And I'm going to apply a new adjustment. And this time it's going to be based upon levels. Now when I select levels, you can see that we are in fact missing quite a bit of shadow detail. What I'm going to do is come over here and click auto. And you can see that Photoshop decides what needs to be done and makes the following corrections. And of course you could always come in here and make any modifications to the black point, to the white point, to the gamma point. That's completely up to you. Now, what's really happening here, if you hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows and click the Auto button, it's going to open up this dialog box. What this dialog box is showing you is this new feature here, Enhance Brightness and Contrast. And this is important because what Photoshop is doing is it's applying these adjustments as a composite. If we come over here and select Enhance Monochromatic Contrast, it's the same thing as the Auto Contrast command under the Image menu. If we select Enhance Per Channel Contrast, that's the same thing as selecting Auto Tone. If we select Find Dark and Light Colors, it's the same thing as Auto Colors. What each of these options do, however, is apply the adjustment on a channel-by-channel basis. Meaning, if I were to come over here and select one of these other algorithms, you'll notice that I don't have access to the adjustment information like I did when I had Enhance Brightness and Contrast selected. So that's really the difference. It's harder to come in here and make these modifications when they're being applied to the channels instead of as a composite. So just be aware of that. So quite frankly, the curves adjustment works in the same way. If you were to come in here and look at this dialog box with the curves adjustment, as long as you have Enhance Brightness and Contrast selected for the algorithm, you'll be able to make modifications to the curves based upon the auto starting point. Whereas if you select any one of these other algorithms, you won't have access to that information. So these are some new features inside of CS6 that allow you to start applying adjustments and have Photoshop do the starting part of the work for you. It gets you to a point where the image is starting to look better, and if it doesn't look exactly the way that you want it to, you can come in and further modify the adjustments that Photoshop made. Of course, with a new version of Photoshop comes a brand new version of Camera Raw. Camera Raw is essentially the development module brought over from Adobe's Lightroom. Lightroom 4 just came out, and that development module has been improved. They've taken those improvements and built them into Camera Raw 7. What Camera Raw allows you to do is develop your images from your digital camera's RAW format. It allows you to also adjust colors of JPEGs and TIFFs and images with more precision than some of Photoshop's built-in functions. So what I want to do is just kind of quickly review what they've done here in ACR 7. We're going to have a complete separate title for Camera Raw once Adobe releases Photoshop CS6. So what I'd like to do, like I said, is just show you some of the improvements that have been made. Now, if you've worked with previous versions of Camera Raw, you'll notice right away that the sliders have changed quite a bit. If you open up an image that you worked with in a previous version of Camera Raw, when you open it up in Camera Raw 7, you'll see all the legacy sliders in place. There'll be a little warning telling you that you've modified that image in a previous version. And if you decide to convert it, then all of the new technology that Adobe built into Camera Raw 7 will be available to that image. So if we take a look at this, you'll notice that they did change all of these sliders over here on the right, and they've changed the order in a way that makes a little bit more sense. This is how you would logically approach an image. You would change exposure and contrast, then you'd move into highlights and shadows, and then you would get into some of these other details. So they organized these elements in a much better way. Contrast has been greatly improved, but before we talk about contrast, let's go ahead and just look at the exposure slider. The exposure slider is similar to that of the brightness slider from previous versions, but it has more precision and it really just controls the midtone. So if I wanted to, I could increase the exposure or decrease it. And as I drag this slider to the right, I increase it, and obviously if I drag it to the left, I decrease it. And you can kind of see this histogram up here that's giving you some real-time feedback as you drag these sliders, and you'll notice that the image is also changing, and it's changing in a way that really makes a lot of sense and isn't all that damaging, unlike previous adjustments that could be made in Camera Raw 6 and earlier. The contrast does just that. You can increase or decrease the contrast within a particular image, and you can also start adjusting highlights and shadows. When you start working with these different values, you're isolating just the highlights or just the shadows. There's also some new sliders here for whites and blacks that give you a lot of control, much like you would have in a levels adjustment. You can set black and white points. If you want to go ahead and increase the whites in the image, you can do that. Same thing with the blacks. Now, clarity is greatly improved as well. Adobe's done a pretty good job with this feature. What it allows you to do is literally increase the clarity within the image. Now, in previous versions, if you messed around with clarity too much, you would sometimes get a haloing effect around the subject. And you can see in this case, it really is just making the image a lot clearer. It's actually pretty phenomenal the way that it works. So you're going to want to come in and take a look at some of these new sliders that they added here inside of Camera Raw 7. The other thing that they've done is they've added some functionality to this adjustment brush. You'll notice in the adjustment brush you have the ability to control all the usual elements like exposure, contrast, but you also have the ability now to reduce noise and moire patterns. So if we take a look at this noise reduction, if I go ahead and increase the prominence of this to make it a little bit more obvious, if I start painting, especially here, we did generate a little bit of noise with those adjustments that we made. If I go ahead and click and drag, you'll notice that it does in fact remove the noise. It was obviously amped up a little bit too much, and I've just really kind of blown out that area a little bit, but it really does a nice job of reducing noise. I have a little bit more noise down here in the shadow detail, which isn't uncommon. If I click and drag, you'll notice that it does a pretty good job of getting rid of that. So there's a lot here inside of Camera Raw 7.0. Unfortunately, there's so much here, it probably doesn't make sense to really go into the fine details of how all these elements work, but it's safe to say if you come into Camera Raw 7, and if you've worked with previous versions of Camera Raw, you'll notice dramatic improvements with all the sliders and the organization of the content within this new version of Camera Raw. This next new feature that I'm about to show you may not be new to you if you've ever downloaded the Pixel Bender plugin from labs.adobe.com. Inside that plugin, there was a filter called Oil Paint, and they built it into Photoshop CS6. So let's go ahead and quickly take a look at how you can use this filter. I'm working with a document called louis.jpg. I should probably convert this into a smart object, so I'll go ahead and right-click or control-click and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now that it's a smart object, I'm going to come up to the Filter menu, and under the Filter menu, I'm going to choose Oil Paint. This will bring up a dialog box, and immediately you'll notice that the image looks a lot more like a painting. So what we want to do is take a look at how these different sliders play into the overall look of this filter. So first of all, we have the stylization slider. What this really does is kind of determines the length of the brush stroke. So if I drag this all the way to the right, you'll notice I'm getting far more dramatic brush strokes. And you can really see that here in Louis' face. If I drag this slider to the left, it looks a lot less like long brush strokes and almost looks like paint dabs. So I'm going to come over here and drag this slider to somewhere in the 6 to 7 range. So we really do have some brush strokes happening. Cleanliness really refers to the sharpness or the blur values associated with these brush strokes. If I drag this all the way to the right, you'll notice I get a very blurred out looking image. Whereas if I drag it to the right, I get sharper looking brush strokes. And you can really begin to see this if you zoom into the image. So I've zoomed into the image now, and you can see that the cleanliness is over here on the left-hand side. You can really see the details of these brush strokes. Whereas if I drag this all the way over to the right, they get far more blurred out and less pronounced. So I prefer this slider down here towards the left side just a bit. I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out just a tad. Then we have scale, which is really the fine detail. It's almost like the brush stroke direction, if you can imagine that. If I drag this to the right, you'll just see the brush strokes kind of move around a little bit. And you can kind of play with this until you get the exact details that you're looking for. You can really see the changes happening here in his chest. And also if you take a look at some of these grass elements as well, you can really see how the brushstroke direction is almost changing. Then we also have bristle detail, which is the sharpness of that brushstroke. Again, if I zoom into Louis' face here, if I drag the bristle detail all the way down to the left, you can see that I'm losing a lot of those fine little brush strokes, almost like each individual element of the brush tip is gone. Whereas if I drag this all the way to the right, you certainly see more bristle patterns from the brush. And then, of course, down here towards the bottom, we have lighting, which you can determine the direction of the lighting. If you just go ahead and drag this slider to the left or to the right, you're just kind of changing how the shadows and highlights play off of those brush strokes. And then finally, we have shine. The shine, if you mouse over it, reads that it sets the shine of the reflections. What that really means in Photoshop, if you drag it too much to the right, you're going to get this horrible embossed effect. So not exactly sure why you would ever want to do this, but that's what shine will do. It really makes these brush strokes incredibly deep. And like I said, you really get this embossed effect, which you're probably not looking for. So if you keep this down on the lower side, you get a much softer looking brush stroke and overall image. So the oil paint filter is new in Photoshop CS6. It gives you the ability very quickly and easily to come into the program and create an oil painting of an image. It's been my experience that this filter works best with images like this image here of Louis with a lot of sharp details like the blades of grass and the strands of his fur, you get far more interesting results than, say, you would if you used it on an image like a car. There's less detail to create these fine bristle strokes across the image. Adobe has completely eliminated the Repoussé panel inside of CS6. Now, if you want to work with 3D type, you work directly inside the document, and the type is always editable. So there's been some great improvements here inside of CS6. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we can work with 3D type. In order for us to do that, I'd like you to come over and choose the type tool. With the type tool selected, go ahead and type something into the document. I'm going to go ahead and type in 3D type. Once you type in the text and you've specified your font and the size and the color, come over and choose the Move tool. Now, for my purposes, I think the text is a little too small, so I'm going to go ahead and activate the Free Transform command. Command T is the keyboard shortcut on the Mac side, Control T on Windows. I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale. Once I'm happy with the new size of the type, I'm going to press Enter or Return on the keyboard to accept that transformation. Now that I have the type set, I'm ready to extrude it. So I'm going to come up to the 3D menu, and under the 3D menu, I'm going to choose the new 3D extrusion from selected layer. You'll notice right now I do in fact have the type layer as the active layer. So once I select this command, a dialog box will appear, and Photoshop is asking me to switch to the 3D workspace. You don't have to do this, but it certainly makes sense because it makes working with your 3D objects a lot easier. I'll go ahead and select Yes. When I do that, you'll notice that the type is extruded and the interface changes. The way that Adobe provides you with various controls is really between two different panels. We have the 3D panel, and then we also have the Properties panel. And you'll notice here inside the 3D panel, you have access to your meshes, your lights, your material, your camera, all sorts of different 3D objects are available here. And if you select a particular object, not only will it change here within the document, the Properties panel also is updated to give you the appropriate controls for that element. For our purposes right now, I want to be in the camera view, and you can always get into the camera view by selecting the object here inside the 3D panel or interacting with the elements within the document. If you want to adjust the camera, you can always come down here to the bottom left-hand corner and click on this little icon that you see here. Once you have this selected, and as long as you have the Move tool selected, you can click and drag to change the camera angle. So I'm just going to go ahead and change the angle of this a little bit. Once I'm happy with the angle of the camera, I may want to change various properties of this type. For example, if I come over and click on the mesh, and if I'm having trouble selecting the mesh, again, you can always come over here and click on it. When you do that, you get this little widget, and I've been working with the 3D type engine for a little bit inside of CS6, so mine may appear a little bit larger than yours. If you want to increase this widget, you can do that by clicking on this little transparent box here. If you hold down the Shift key and click and drag up, you'll increase the scale of it. If you click and drag down, you'll decrease the scale of it. Now, what's nice about this, when you increase the scale of it, you have access to all these little handles and controls within this widget, so it makes it a lot easier to work with this content. So if we want to pull the type forward a little bit, notice right now the little tooltip is indicating that if I click and drag, I can move along either the X, Z, or Y axis. So if I go ahead and click and drag now, I'm moving along the X axis, which isn't what I want to do because I'm distorting the type a little bit. What I want to do is move along the Z axis. So if I click and drag now, I'm pulling the type forward. If I click and drag to the left, I'm pushing the type back. So I want it forward a little bit more. So I have control over the positioning and sizing of all these elements. If I wanted to tilt it back a little bit, I would have that ability as well. Just click and drag up, and you'll notice I'm tilting it back just a tad. After tilting it back, if you decide you want to control maybe the depth of the extrusion, you can do that as well. So right now I still have the 3D type selected, which is what I want. But up here in the properties, you'll notice we have several different categories. And right now I'm on the mesh, but if I move over here, I'll come over to deform. And this gives you the ability to control the extrusion depth. And you'll also notice that the heads-up display here within the document also changes. Now you can toggle between these different categories if you have the Move tool selected by pressing the V key. As you know, the V key selects the Move tool, but because we're working in this 3D space, it gives us the ability to move through these different categories within the Properties panel. If I hold down the Shift key and press V, I'm going to toggle between the 3D modes up here inside the toolbar. So Shift FV gives you that ability, V gives you the ability to toggle through the property categories. So in our case, what we want to do is adjust the extrusion depth. I can do that here within the panel by clicking and dragging this slider, or we can just interact with this little 3D element here. If I click and drag down, you'll notice I'm decreasing the extrusion. If I click and drag up, I'm increasing the extrusion. So I want it to be somewhere around right here. After changing the extrusion, what I can do is come over to this category, which is the cap, and I can change the bevel. Again, I can interact with this little mapping system that is in place here within the document, or I can just adjust it here within the panel, whichever I prefer. If I control the angle, you'll notice not only does it change here within the panel, the little widget is also giving me real-time feedback about how I can control that particular property within this panel. So if I want to change the width, I also have that ability. So I'm going to bump it up a little bit. And if I also want to change the angle, I have that ability and also the strength. Finally, I may want to control the contour. If I access this little menu system here, I can choose a particular contour, and you'll notice it gets updated and changed. Finally, what I want to do is start changing the material a little bit. So to change the material, what we need to do is make sure that the mesh itself is selected. And with the mesh selected, you'll notice inside the 3D panel, we have the 3D type and all these sub-elements. I want to go ahead and select the front inflation material. And I'm going to come over here inside the Properties panel and access this menu and select from one of these predefined materials. Now, of course, you can create your own material if you want, but in this case, I'm going to come over here and select this material, and you'll notice that it's updated. So not only do I want to change the front mesh, but I also want to change the front bevel. So I'm going to come over here and select this, and I'm going to choose something similar. And then finally, I'm also going to change the extrusion material to maybe this red material down here towards the bottom. So with all that updated, what we then want to do is render the scene. You can, of course, change any lighting elements if you want. You'll notice there's a little icon here for infinite light. You can select it, or you could always come over here to the 3D panel and select it from here as well. Maybe you want to change the softness of your shadows. You can do that as well. I'll just go ahead and amp this up a little bit. And then I'm ready to render. There's two different ways that you can render. You can click this little box down here in the Properties panel, which is probably the easiest way, or you can come up to the 3D menu, and under the 3D menu, here you can choose Render. Or of course you can mash your keys on the keyboard for this keyboard shortcut. I'm going to go ahead and select Render, and when I do, Photoshop's going to do a ray trace pass. It may take a little bit for it to complete that, and you'll get a little readout down here towards the bottom in terms of how long it's going to take. We're just about done. When it is done, what I'll do is show you a couple of different things that you can do after you've created this 3D type. Once Photoshop is done with the render, you could come over to something like the Layers panel. And inside of the Layers panel, you'll notice there's a 3D type layer. Well, here you have the ability to modify the layer much like you would any other layer inside of Photoshop. So you can imagine the flexibility that you now have when working with 3D type inside the program. If you want to do something like change the blend mode, you have that available to you. You can even change the opacity. So all this can be done to this 3D element just by adjusting the Layers panel like you would any other object in Photoshop. But the real power comes when you decide to edit the type. Let's say, for example, I wanted to put a hyphen here inside the type. If you want to do that, all you have to do is right-click or control-click, and this 3D type panel will appear. All you have to do is click Edit Source. When you click Edit Source, it opens up what looks like a smart object. So you'd place a blinking cursor in between 3 and D, and you would type in the hyphen. You would then come over and highlight the Move tool and close out of this document. Of course, you're going to have to save it, so go ahead and click Save. And when you do, you're brought back into Photoshop and the text has been updated. So this is all brand new inside of Photoshop CS6. The way you work with 3D type has been greatly improved. Adobe's added some new filters into Photoshop CS6, and they're blur filters specifically. These 3 blur filters are built into something called the Blur Gallery. And over the next movie or two, what I'd like to do is take a look at these different filters. The Blur Gallery gives you the ability to create varying degrees of depth of field effects. And what I want to do is go into the Blur Gallery. And before I do that, I want to point out that anytime I work with filters, I would tend to convert my image into a smart object. That's not an option with the Blur Gallery. You can't work with smart objects with the Blur Gallery, so unfortunately that's not an option. So what I'm going to do is come up to the filter menu, and under the filter menu I'm going to select Blur. And off the submenu, the first 3 elements will open up the Blur Gallery. Depending upon which one you select, it doesn't really matter. All 3 open up the Blur Gallery. In this case, we want to apply a field blur, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. And it applies the field blur. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll notice that all your panels go away. And it's just revealing the necessary panels for these blur tools, which are these new blur filters, these 3 here. And you'll notice you can apply all 3 of these filters at the same time, if need be. Now, we don't need to do that. We're just going to focus on the field blur for right now. But one thing that you will notice, even though you're brought into this new environment, you do have the ability to go to the window menu, and under the window menu, you can open up different panels. Now, if you take a look under most of the menu elements within each of these topics, most of them are grayed out. They're not available, but some are. So that's an interesting way to work with a filter. You don't always have those options available to you when applying the filter. Now, if you do open up something like the Layers panel, again, you can't switch the layer, but it does give you information about the layer that you're working with. If you open up these panels and decide that they're getting in the way and you don't want them there, in the top right-hand corner under the Blur Gallery menu, you can reset the workspace, and it will reconfigure to the default appearance of the Blur Gallery. So right now we have the field blur applied, and you can see that it's a uniform blur applied to the entire image. And you can control the strength of that blur using this slider here. If I click and drag to the right, I'll increase the strength. If I click and drag to the left, I'll decrease it. As I increase and decrease these values, you'll notice that not only am I changing the value here within the slider, but also this little pin here. This little pin is giving you information about how much blur you have applied to the image. And you can control it here as well. If I click and drag, you'll notice I can increase or decrease the blur as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this pin over here to the bottom left, which may have you questioning why I would want to do that if I have a uniform blur applied to the image. Well, what you can do with this field blur is you can apply multiple pins, and that's really the power of this filter. If I come over and set a pin here, on this pin I can reduce the blur, and what Photoshop does is it creates a easy, smooth transition between these 2 blur points, ultimately giving you the ability to change the depth of field. So here I'm bringing this portion of the image into focus by reducing the blur. But you'll notice it's not a hard transition between this pin and this pin that we set over here. It's a nice gradual change. And you can add as many pins as you find necessary to get the effect that you're looking for. You can also apply bokeh effects, or bokeh, however you want to say it. So if I want to apply a light bokeh, I can just come over here and click and drag to the right, and you'll notice at this point, in terms of the light range, the luminance values that I'm affecting are on the brighter side, so I'm getting that appearance over here in the top left-hand corner. You could also deal with bokeh colors as well in this slider, but for our purposes right now, I'm not interested in applying this. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect it. And once you're happy with the image, you can go ahead and click OK, and the filter will be applied. What we'll do in the next movie is we'll take a look at how the iris blur works, giving you an idea as to how some of these other blur tools work inside of the new Blur Gallery. Let's go ahead and take a look at the iris blur in this movie. I'm working with an image called 100m.jpg, which is available inside your resources folder. To apply the iris blur, we're going to come up to the filter menu, and from there we're going to choose blur, and then we're going to choose iris blur. And this is going to bring us into the blur gallery, just like the field blur that we applied in the last movie. Now, like the field blur, you'll notice we have a pin with a heads-up display giving us some on-screen controls. We can also make adjustments within the Blur Tools panel and also up here in the Options bar. First of all, we have our focus, which is set to 100%. The focal point is the center point of this pin, and right now the focus of that pin is set to 100%. If you wanted to dial that back, you have that ability. What I want to do is move this pin, so I'm just going to click and drag it on top of the headlight here. And you'll notice that we have a fairly interesting set of handles here. And what we're going to do is kind of go through each of them so you know what it is that they do. Well, first of all, these handles over here on the outside give you the ability to apply a rotation and also a distortion effect of essentially how that blur is being placed. You can make a elliptical type shape, or you can bring it in closer to a circle. That's completely up to you, and you can also apply this rotation. So that's what those handles do. This little white square that you see up here gives you the ability to make the shape a little bit more rectangular in nature instead of a circular blur. Then what we have is this line, which basically represents the blur point. And the blur point right now is set to 15 pixels. So everything outside of this line is blurred to 15 pixels. And then what we do is we gradually get from 15 pixels to this 100% value here based upon these handles. If I click and drag these handles inward, I'm essentially spanning that blur out even further. So we're 15 pixels here on the edge and coming all the way into 100% focus. Now, if you click and drag these out, obviously you're making a larger area set to 100% focus. And you can also move these independently by holding down the Alt key on Windows, Option on the Mac, and now I can move this one separate from the other three. Now, something else that you can do with the iris blur is you can save the mask to a channel if you want to do that. If you press the M key on your keyboard and hold down, you'll see that mask. Now, if that's something that you want to save as an alpha channel, you have that ability by selecting this option here. I'm just going to go ahead and let go of the M key on the keyboard to return back to the image. And of course, you also have the light bokeh options as well, just like you did with the field blur. So once you're happy with this, you can go ahead and click OK to apply the filter. Before you do that, though, I just want to point out, like the field blur, you do have the ability to set multiple pins inside the image if that's something that you want to do. If you don't want to do it, you have one level of undo. Control-Z or Command-Z will allow you to do that. So that's the iris blur in the blur gallery in Photoshop CS6. So quickly, what I'd like to do is show you how the tilt-shift blur works within the blur gallery. Again, it's a lot like some of the other blur tools that we were looking at that's inside of the blur gallery in terms of how you work with it. So let's go ahead and apply it. I'm working with vintagerace.jpg, which is available inside your resources folder. What we want to do is come up to the filter menu, and from there we're going to choose blur, and then we're going to choose tilt-shift. And this brings us back into the blur gallery. So what we want to do here is basically manipulate these controls. And you can see that you have similar options as you did with the other blur tools inside the blur gallery. Here we have the blur. Right now it's set to 15 pixels, meaning this dashed line from here up is 15 pixels of blur. The focal point, which is this pin that we have set here, is set to 100% focus. So we have a gradual change from the 15 pixel blur to the 100% focus. Now, if we want to control this, we can move these bars here by simply clicking and dragging. Now, you have the ability to rotate the tilt shift in this case. I'm not interested in doing that, so I'm going to hold down the shift key. And with the shift key selected, you'll notice I'm not rotating at all. The little heads-up display tooltip is telling me that it's set to 0 degrees. So I want to move this down a little bit. I want to do the same thing for the bottom bar. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this up. And then I'm going to move the pin on top of this car here. And so we have this in perfect focus while everything else is getting blurred out. And of course, you have the same options here. You can save the mask to channels if that's something that you want to do. You can hold down the M key to temporarily take a look at that mask. If you want to save it as an alpha channel, like I said, you could select that option here. So that was a quick review of the tilt shift blur, but a lot of the functionality and features are very similar to the other two blurs that are built into the blur gallery. As we talk about filters, there's another new filter inside of Photoshop CS6 that gives you the ability to correct lens distortion associated with wide-angle lenses. And this filter is fairly elaborate, so what I'd like to do is just touch upon it now so you're aware of its availability and somewhat aware of how it behaves. So I'm working with this image called prog.jpg, which is available inside your resources folder. What I'd like to do is come up to the filter menu, and under the filter menu, you can choose Adaptive Wide Angle, and this is going to open up the dialog box for this filter. Now, if you have an image that has lens information or camera information, it'll appear down here towards the bottom, and this correction menu will be set to auto. And it'll take the information from your camera and try to do its best job of making the appropriate modifications. In this case, we don't have a lens profile found, so I'll go ahead and click OK. So you don't need the profile in order for you to correct the image. Again, there's a lot of options here, but what I'd like to take a look at, first of all, is just what these menu options are. We have a fisheye correction, a perspective correction, and as you move through these, you can see the image change slightly. And we also have full spherical, which we don't need, and in this case, it's not even relevant. So I'll go ahead and click OK. So I'm really just looking to straighten this image out a little bit, and the quickest and easiest way to do that is to have this first tool selected right here, which is the constraint tool. And what I want to do is click at the top of the building. I'm going to click and drag downwards. And I'm going to go ahead to right about there. After drawing this line, what I want to do is tell Photoshop that I want this portion to be a perfectly straight line vertically. And I can do that by control-clicking or right-clicking on the line, and I can choose vertical. When that happens, you'll notice the image, in this case, rotates to make this a vertical line. And I could come in and do the same thing for this tower if I felt like it was necessary, but it's in pretty good shape right now. But you always have the ability to perform that operation more than once. And you can even create horizontal lines as well. So if I go ahead and do this, I could always right-click and choose horizontal. And you may see, again, some more modifications and adjustments. Now, depending upon how much distortion your image has, would ultimately result in more or less cropping that you need to perform once you get back into Photoshop. But I did want to make you aware of this new adaptive wide-angle filter that's available inside of CS6. It's mainly designed to help you correct with lens distortion when working with images taken with wide-angle lenses. Adobe's made some improvements to the color range command in the way of making selections with skin tones. In fact, the feature is called skin tones. What I'd like to do is take a look at this new feature. Now, this feature is not designed to be able to select a person from an image and then move them somewhere. The idea behind this new feature gives you the ability to limit filter effects or isolate various color adjustments, things along those lines. So that's what these tools have been designed to do. So in order for us to really take a look at that, I'm going to apply a filter to this image. I'm working with model.psd, which is available inside your resources folder. The first thing that I'm going to do is right-click or control-click on this layer and convert it to a smart object. Once we convert it to a smart object, I want to apply a filter. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to come up to the filter menu, and under the filter menu, we might as well take a look at the oil paint filter since that's a new filter inside of Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is just kind of clean this up a little bit so it looks a little bit better. I'm going to drop the shine down so it's a little less embossed. And once I'm happy with the effect, I'll go ahead and just maybe adjust the stylization a little bit and drag the brush detail back down. Okay, so that looks good. I'll go ahead and click OK. That's now been applied to the image. You'll notice that there's a Smart Filter Mask. And what I want to do is get rid of that. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click on it and choose Delete Filter Mask. Now, if I want to limit the effects of this filter on the model's face, what I can do is come up to the Select menu. And under the Select menu, I can choose Color Range. Once you choose color range, if you're not familiar with how this command works, it works a lot like the magic wand tool, but with more control. Here you have some eyedroppers, and what you can do is sample an area within the image. You can also click and drag. Now, if you want to add to that sample, you can click this eyedropper tool over here with the plus sign to add to it. Then you can adjust the fuzziness to increase the impact of that selection. Now, what I want to do is come up to the Select menu, and instead of choosing sampled colors now, I'm going to go ahead and select skin tones. And you'll notice it does a pretty good job of selecting all these skin tones. Now, I happen to have this option here, Detect Faces, turned on. If I turn that off, you'll notice it really selects all of the skin tones, but you'll notice I'm getting a lot of white values against black values. There's not a lot of tonal range here, which ultimately is going to produce for a very harsh effect. What we want are some subtle transitions. In order for us to get those subtle transitions, we need some gray values. And that's what Detect Faces does inside this color range command. Not only does it select the skin tones, but it realizes that you're dealing with a human, essentially, and it accounts for some of these shadows within the image. And this ultimately is going to produce a better effect for you. Now, when you have skin tone selected in Detect Faces, again, it doesn't really matter how light or dark the subject is. All people have some type of orange color value within their skin tone. So it doesn't really matter how dark or how light the model is in this case. The skin tones option will work the same. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to come over here and click OK. Once I click OK, I have this selection. And in order for me to essentially apply this to the image, what I want to do is right-click or control-click on my Smart Filter, and I want to add a filter mask. And you'll notice that that mask is now applied. And you can see that it's limiting the effect of that oil paint filter that we applied. If you wanted to see the before and after, I could disable the mask by right-clicking on it or control-clicking on it and choosing Disable Filter Mask. This is what it looked like before we went into the color range command and used the new skin tone and Detect Faces options within that command. I'll go ahead and enable it again, and we were able to limit the effects of that filter on this image. So that's what those commands are used for inside of CS6, giving you the ability to make more precise and organic looking selections when dealing with people and skin tone values. I've really just scratched the surface of what's new inside of Photoshop CS6, but I really wanted to focus on the features that I thought most users would find relevant. There are some additional video and 3D enhancements. All of those options will be available in the extended version of Photoshop CS6. The last thing that I want to leave you with are two features that I think will come in handy for anyone who uses Photoshop for any length of time. It's something called background save, and then there's autosave. Background save can be very helpful if you work with numerous documents at the same time and happen to be working in a fairly large document. The document I have open right now is 782 megabytes. So if I come over and make some type of modification, I'm just going to access the free transform command, Command-T or Control-T on Windows. I'm going to scale something down. I don't even know what I have selected. It looks like a lighting element. I'll go ahead and press enter or return because I made the change. I'll go ahead and save it. And once I save it, you'll notice there's a little indicator right here telling you how the progress is going. And you have the ability to switch to a different document as that save takes place. And it's telling you up in the tab, it just went away, what the indication was in terms of how the save was going. Again, I'll just go ahead and show you that one more time. I'll access the free transform command and adjust something, and then I'll save it. You can see the percentage readout here and at the bottom. If I move over to the next document, that little percentage indicator is there in this tab. So that's background save. If you're working with large documents, again, you don't have to tie up Photoshop and just sit around and wait for it to save. You can move on and do something else. The other thing is autosave. If you go to the Photoshop menu, and under the Photoshop menu, you choose Preferences, and from there, you choose File Handling. This same menu structure is available on the Windows side, but it's under the Edit menu. It's going to open up the Preferences dialog box, and you'll notice that you can automatically save recovery information every In this case, I have it set to 5 minutes, but you can control this to be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so on and so forth. I prefer 5 minutes, so with this selected, I'll go ahead and click OK. You'll notice that there's been a modification to this document. What I've done really is I've scaled down this text here. And let's just say for whatever reason I lose power and I don't have battery backup and the system goes down. Well, at that point, because you didn't save your last change in previous versions of Photoshop, you were kind of, out of luck. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to force quit Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. I'll force quit it. Photoshop just went down. So now what I want to do is recall Photoshop. I'm going to come into the bridge. Inside the bridge, I'm going to go into the resources folder, and the image that I was working on is inside this website folder, and there's a file called index.psd. I'll go ahead and open that up. When I open it up, it's going to launch Photoshop again, and as it launches Photoshop, this document will open, much like you would expect it to, without the changes that we made. It'll just take a moment here for this to load. And once the document opens, you'll notice another tab opens up with it, which is the recovered file, which has the changes that I made to the size of the text. So autosave can really come in handy if Photoshop ever crashes or goes down, or your system crashes or goes down. You have a safety net there. Every 5 minutes, if you set it to that, Photoshop will save recovery information. Well, that's going to conclude this title on what the new features are inside of Photoshop CS6. And like I said, when you deal with 3D and video, there's even some more capabilities there. That's something that we'll cover in future titles on Train Simple's website. So I would recommend coming back to our site and checking out to see what we have available. As Photoshop comes out of beta, we have several different titles already in production to coincide with the release of Photoshop CS6.